There's a generation of people who learned a dangerous lesson very early in life. No one is coming to help you. You've probably met one of them. They're the person who never panics in a crisis, who quietly looks around, figures out what needs to be done, and handles it. No drama, no complaints, no asking for help. Most people think that kind of independence is a personality trait. But for an entire generation, it wasn't a choice. It was something they learned as children. Because when you grow up believing you're on your own, you stop waiting for help. You stop expecting support. You just handle things yourself. And if you know someone who never complains, never asks for help, and always manages everything alone, there's a good chance they belong to this generation. This is the psychology of Generation X. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. The generation sandwiched between the massive cultural presence of the baby boomers and the endlessly analyzed world of millennials. They are, in many ways, the generation that the culture forgot to watch over. And that sentence isn't dramatic, it's almost literally true. Gen X grew up during one of the most turbulent social periods in recent Western history. The rapid rise of divorce rates, widespread economic instability, the Cold War humming quietly in the background, and the beginning of a media landscape that was simultaneously expanding and becoming more violent, more sexual, more confusing, all while the adults around them were often preoccupied with their own upheaval. What that produced wasn't a broken generation. It produced a very specific psychological profile, one built for survival, not comfort, one shaped less by what was given to them and more by what was consistently absent. Understanding Gen X isn't really about their music tastes or their flannel shirts. It's about understanding what happens to a person when they learn very early that no one is coming to save them. There's a term that almost perfectly captures the Gen X childhood experience: latchkey kid. A latchkey kid is a child who comes home from school to an empty house. They let themselves in with a key that hangs around their neck. They make their own snacks. They do their own homework. They figure things out alone until an adult comes home, sometimes hours later. This was enormously common for Gen X. More women had entered the workforce, more families were navigating divorce, and the cultural philosophy of the era didn't lean toward helicopter parenting or constant supervision. Children were expected to be independent, and Gen X was. But here's what that kind of early independence actually does to a child's psychology. It creates what researchers sometimes describe as a compressed sense of self-reliance, the internal belief that you are fundamentally responsible for yourself, that waiting for help is unreliable, that it's better and safer to figure it out than to ask. On the surface, that looks like strength, and in many ways it is strength. Gen X adults tend to be enormously resourceful, calm under pressure, and deeply capable of functioning without external validation. But underneath that capability lives something else, a quiet assumption that depending on others leads to disappointment, that emotional needs are best managed alone, that asking for help is a form of weakness, or worse, an imposition. That's not wisdom. That's conditioning. One of the most recognizable patterns in Gen X psychology is a particular relationship with emotion. Specifically, the tendency to manage it quietly, privately, and often through humor. Gen X developed what could be called emotional compression. Feelings are acknowledged internally, but rarely expressed outwardly. And when the pressure gets too heavy, it doesn't come out as vulnerability,
It comes out as dark humor, sarcasm, and irony. This is actually a very sophisticated coping mechanism. When you grow up in an environment where expressing emotional needs either isn't safe, isn't effective, or simply goes unnoticed, you learn to contain. And containment over time becomes identity. The stoic one, the tough one, the one who's fine. Except fine doesn't always mean fine. Gen X learned to present competence as a shield, to keep their emotional interior private, even from the people closest to them. And while that protected them during a childhood where self-reliance was necessary, it can follow them into adulthood in ways that feel less like protection and more like isolation. What looks like not needing people is often just never fully learned how to need them safely. That's not a flaw. That's a survival strategy that outlasted its original context.
And here's where it gets interesting. Most conversations about Gen X focus on their independence as a strength, and it is. But the part that doesn't get talked about as much is this. A generation that was taught not to expect support often becomes the generation that never asks for it, even when they need it, even when it's available. Because the internal programming runs deep. The belief isn't always conscious. It's something closer to a reflex. Handle it yourself. Don't make it a big deal. You'll be fine. It was never about being cold. It was about having learned very early that the world doesn't pause for your feelings. There's another defining psychological trait of Gen X, and it shows up everywhere. A deep, almost reflexive skepticism. Gen X watched institutions fail in real time. They saw political scandals erode trust in government. They watched corporations downsize their parents and redefine job security as something that no longer existed. They grew up in a media landscape that was beginning, for the first time, to cynically commodify rebellion and sell it back to young people. They noticed the gap between what authority figures said and what was actually true, and they stopped believing the performance. This isn't cynicism for its own sake, it's pattern recognition. When you've watched enough institutions promise one thing and deliver another, skepticism becomes the most rational response. It's protective intelligence, not nihilism. But it shapes behavior in interesting ways. Gen X tends to be deeply averse to hype. They distrust enthusiasm that seems manufactured. They're suspicious of movements that feel corporate. And they have an almost allergic reaction to being sold something, whether that something is a product, an ideology, or a person. What looks like disengagement is often discernment. Gen X is often called the forgotten generation. And there's a psychological dimension to that framing worth sitting with. They came after the boomers, a generation so massive it reshaped culture by sheer demographic force. And they came before millennials, a generation that arrived into a world already anxious about its own future, documented every step of the way. Gen X arrived in the middle. Small in number compared to both generations surrounding them, often passed over in cultural analysis, in marketing, in conversations about social change. And there's something quietly formative about growing up in that invisible space. People who grow up not being seen, not because they were rejected, but simply because no one was paying particular attention, often develop a distinctive relationship with recognition. They don't expect it. They don't orient their behavior around receiving it, and when it comes, they often don't quite know what to do with it. This is part of why Gen X can seem so unbothered by external validation. It's not just stoicism, it's that the internal compass was built in the absence of consistent external feedback. They learned to evaluate their own work, make their own judgments, and move forward without waiting for approval. That kind of self-determination is genuinely powerful. It's also, at times, lonely. Perhaps the most underappreciated psychological trait of Gen X is adaptability. They came of age at the exact moment the world began accelerating in a way no generation had experienced before. Analog to digital, typewriters to computers, landlines to the internet, physical stores to e-commerce. They didn't grow up in a stable world. They grew up watching the world they knew dissolve and reassemble into something entirely different repeatedly. And they adapted. Not with the enthusiasm of a generation that grew up native to technology, and not with the resistance of a generation that found the changes disorienting. Gen X adapted with the quiet pragmatism of people who learned young that the environment changes and your job is to keep up. This shows up in how they navigate work, relationships, and life transitions. Gen X tends not to catastrophize change the way generations with more certainty in their foundations sometimes do. Change is familiar. Uncertainty is old news. What looks like detachment is often just the calm of someone who has already metabolized the idea that stability is not guaranteed and built their psychology around that truth rather than against it. Generation X grew up in the in-between, between childhood and independence too early, between boom and millennial, demographically invisible, between the world as it was and the world as it was rapidly becoming. And in that in-between space, they built something quiet and durable, a psychology of self-sufficiency, of skeptical clarity, of humor as armor and adaptability as identity, of handling things without making a production of it. It was never just a generational attitude. It was a psychological architecture, built response by response, year by year, in the absence of the one thing every child is supposed to have in abundance: someone watching. They learned to watch themselves. Once you understand that, the independence makes sense, the skepticism makes sense, the dark humor, the emotional restraint, the quiet competence, all of it traces back to the same origin. It was never random. It was a pattern, built in childhood, carried forward, and in many ways, still running. If this explains something about someone you know or about yourself, there's a lot more to uncover. Understanding where a pattern comes from is the first step to understanding why it's still here.